Hello, good morning, and welcome to the early risers, although it's almost 10 in the morning. Thank you for being with us. My name is Christine Ockrent. I'm a journalist based in Paris, and I have the privilege to try and moderate a very distinguished panel. Loukas Tsoukalis, who is the president of the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy here in Greece. Daniela Schwarzer, who runs the German Council on Foreign Relations. The Minister Delegate for European Affairs of Romania, Ambassador George Ciamba. Correct me if my Romanian pronunciation is not correct. Jacques Rupnik, Senior Research Fellow at Sciences Po in Paris. Sandro Gozi, former Undersecretary for European Affairs in Rome, and Jean Pisani-Ferry, Senior Fellow at Bruegel and also European University Institute in Florence. Where is Europe heading to? I believe, as we all remember, it's the kind of question which we've been asking ourselves ever since Europe exists. Every year or so, where are we heading to? Because indeed, the very unique process, very imperfect, but in a way very democratic, that very unique process of trying to build this very strange construction has led, of course, to heaps forward, backwards, sideways, frog walk. But after some 60 years, it's still here, and it is still the strongest commercial partner in the world, and obviously the most democratic space for some, 500 million people. So my first question to each panelist, and I will ask them to be disciplined if they are willing to be so, and to make a short answer, would be, we always ask ourselves the same question: why this year around we feel more anxiety and more uncertainty about Europe than ever before? Please, Loukas.
Thank you, Christine. True, and the European project is...
It's only water.
Okay. True, the European project is a revolutionary political project. It is sui generis, so we never know what's going to happen tomorrow because we have no similar experience. But yet, I believe this time is a bit more difficult, much messier than before. What we have experienced in recent years is, first of all, the strengthening of anti-systemic political forces within our countries, anti-systemic forces that are mostly Eurosceptic, if not straightforward anti-European. We have experienced growing divergence between our countries, while at the same time the external environment has changed. We are faced with a US administration that is behaving more and more unilaterally and does not seem to believe in the project of Europe, to put it mildly. We are experiencing new manifestations of revisionism coming from Russia. A large part of our neighborhood has imploded, and it is unlikely to get back into shape anytime soon. The good news in all that is that the experience of recent years has made it clear to the large majority of European citizens that we need the European Union, and we need European unity. And perhaps, among others, we should thank our British friends for making it very clear to the rest of us who decided to stay in. The bad news is that we all know that we need a European Union, we need a stronger European Union, but we cannot agree on the direction of change because there's so much divergence between and within countries that makes it extremely difficult to agree on anything. And this is really the problem I think we've been facing in recent years. The risk of being stuck in a world that changes very rapidly and in which the European Union becomes like a huge tanker in rough seas. It is not likely to sink, but it cannot actually manage it comfortably. And that's the situation, I think. That's how I would summarize it.
And like any tanker, it takes a long time before it can make any move. Daniela, would you subscribe to Loukas' analysis? But I'm sure, knowing you, that you'll have some spice to add.
Well, I don't disagree with anything, but I'm trying to add an extra layer. So you asked about the historical comparison. What is different today to previous times? And I would say that two things. One is Europe has developed over decades and has now reached a depth of integration already that whichever policy area you look at, it becomes substantive and really touches on questions of national sovereignty. For instance, if you look at the Eurozone, it was built without the necessary political institutional framework. It was essentially an integration of the currency, and one knew at the time that more steps would have to follow. And now we see, through the dysfunctionalities over the past decade, roughly, what else we need. But going that step requires a real political leap forward, not only in terms of transferring competencies, but also thinking about the way this then more integrated economy and, yes, political system can be governed democratically. The same, in my view, is true for what we call the Schengen area. First steps were taken, and we said, okay, we want this free circulation of people, we want to integrate, but we didn't think enough about the external borders and how we govern the space that we have created. So now, completing this unfinished house requires a real commitment to a very deep, long-term political entity which we have to build. This, looking at those two examples of why Europe is an unfinished house, in my view, also explains why so much resistance has grown over the years. Because it is not wrong to say that to some extent we lost, or nation states lost the capacity to steer what's happening on their own territory, while at the same time we didn't add those elements on the European level. So this feeling of a loss of control, it's not wrong. So the question is, how do we regain control together? This all obviously happens in a larger context of globalization where we see similar trends of a loss of control, a loss of capacity in the national context to steer our own fate. And the problem that we are now facing is that there are political parties and movements, partially supported from abroad, that take the EU as the scapegoat for everything that is happening, and not in a constructive way asking how can we take this forward, but rather building a narrative that we are better served in the nation-state context. Hence, Europe should be pushed back and dissolved in the view of some people. And so the challenge really is for those who want to maintain the system to develop a narrative, how it can serve the interests how it can remedy the anxieties of people in a very, very complex situation, which is both Europe and globalization, and a decade-long policy which, and Loukas said that, did not pay enough attention to cohesion within societies and between member states.
Thank you, Daniela. Jean Pisani-Ferry, in your view, this notion of loss of control at all levels in our 27 countries, let's assume the UK eventually will decide what it wants to do with itself. What would you add to that, particularly in economic terms?
Thank you. About 15 years ago, I won't go back to 60 years ago, just 15 years ago, we had a seminar in Paris, I think Jacques was there, where Bronislaw Geremek said at some point, Europe is a cooperative of milk producers, and our community of values, it's NATO. This was extremely shocking, but not entirely wrong, because we had redefined Europe in terms, the EU in terms of, as an economic endeavor. It was prosperity through integration, it was a stability of rules, and it had little to do with much else. And, you know, we assumed it would work. And suddenly we've been confronted with a series of shocks that have put into question this view of what Europe is about. There was a financial crisis, which questioned the stability of rules. There's the whole debate about inequality, which questions the approach of prosperity through growth, and climate change adds to that. Obviously, there have been all the issues about security, about refugees. I mean, the return of questions that have more to do with discretionary power than with the economic sphere and the stability of rules. And actually, what happened internally also happened externally, because we had the same vision of the external world. The external world had to be governed by rules that was multilateralism, and by integration and prosperity through integration. That was a good side of globalization. And all that is being questioned. So we're facing a complete redefinition of the agenda of the European public goods. And the difficulty is that we don't agree about what the new public goods should be. And we have great difficulty solving these differences. So to my view, the question is, you know, are we the tanker that Loukas described, or are we able to move? And if we're able to move, it probably means we have to move, we have to accept that there will be more differentiation, that we're not going to sort out differences, fundamental differences on some of those issues. And so we've got to move forward in a different format.
Thank you. Sandro, Gozi, is there indeed fundamental differences? And of course, Italy has been providing plenty of those for the past few months. Is there any way, in your view, that the dynamism of that strange machinery would eventually take over in spite of all these, this lack of, as Jean just put it, no common definition of public goods?
Yeah, possible. Possible. I recognize myself in many of the things that have already been said, notably on the issue of control and on the issue of differentiation. In my view, if I may dwell 1 minute on the causes of the crisis and why the crisis is so serious this time, is that that milk factory was considered as a win-win production for everybody. And this is why in Europe we didn't have a real debate on what we want to do in Europe. Yes, the experts had a debate, but the public opinion accepted the European integration because everybody had the feeling to gain something, to win something. And this win-win approach has blew up during the crisis, where has been replaced by a mutual distrust between government, between people in Europe. And I think that the massive negative impact of the way the financial crisis has been handled and has been communicated within the public opinion and between countries, and I think I'm very well placed in this country to tell you what I mean, has been one of the best fuel in the engine of neo-nationalist forces around Europe. That's the first point. So Europe is not a win-win situation. Europe is something where some people feel they are losing. And this is something which is very difficult to fight. Of course, we need to fight. We can fight it. Absolutely, we can fight it, but it's very difficult to fight. The second issue is that, after all, there is also a global context. Our milk factory was part of a wider system of production, which was the Western world versus Eastern, was part of the Bretton Woods consensus, was part of the transatlantic cooperation. And what we were doing with the single market, it was part of that project. So we were part of a clearly defined international project of the West. Today, we are in a new global disorder, where we have to reinvent the way we govern or we don't govern, we live on the international scene, where multilateralism is at risk, where our best ally follow a unilateralistic approach, where there is the emergence of new continental states, such as China, Brazil, or India, which do not share the same approach to multilateralism. So today, for us, it's much more difficult to find our place as pro-European in Europe, as European on the world scale. We can persuade around, and this is my last point, around the issue exactly of taking back control, public goods, and differentiation. Taking back control was the best slogan that the Brexiters could find. I'm very admirative of this very effective slogan. Very right question. The problem is the answer. The answer is not going back. The answer is not going back to nationalistic policies. The answer is not going back and away from the European Union. If we want to take back control, we have to empower the Union to take back control on transnational issues, on which national democracies and national politics are powerless. And this is, by the way, it is the reason of the crisis of national democracies and the national politics today, that they are asked to handle things which are bigger than them. Migration, terrorism, global finance, global digital powers, fight against climate change. These, in my view, are the new public goods around which we can rebuild a new European project, about which we can give, again, hope about the future through Europe. It is clear that, third and last point, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were 6, 9, 12 countries. Today, we are 27 countries. We will become, I hope, very soon, more than 30 member states. It is impossible to provide these public goods, to take back control, to go towards this common objective all together at the same rate, at the same time. It is clear that the issue of a dynamic group of people and countries based on free political will that take the decision to go faster and more in a stronger way towards this common objective is one, in my view, of the key issue to face now and key issue to face in the next legislature. It is clear that if we accept to be blocked by vetoes, by nationalistic approaches, we will never get there, but we can get there through this method.
But then, of course, there's the whole issue of the unanimity rule, which is a major blockade. Before we hear the minister from Romania, which, as we all know, is now in charge of the rotating presidency, Jacques Rupnik, these transnational issues, which Sandro just referred to, when it comes to the eastern member states of the Union, it's very interesting to see that, on the one hand, there's, of course, a very strong light put on national and national priorities, identity priorities, but there's no question at all of getting out of the Union.
Exactly. This is, I think, the new situation we are in. There is a rise of the centrifugal forces, bring back control to the nation. That's a lesson from Brexit, that the Central European countries were taking, bring back control. And who was guilty for Brexit? It was the European Commission by excessive interference, etc. But as you said, nobody is considering, when they see the spectacle, actually, of what is happening when you go that way, nobody wants to leave. And there are other reasons, which I may come back to, why they wouldn't want to do that. the economic advantages. If you take 3–4% of your GDP in EU funds, you're not in a rush to leave. That's to put it mildly. If you're geographically placed where these countries are, you consider other geopolitical factors, let's say, in your allegiance to the EU, etc. I could go on, but I won't, because I think listening to everybody, I will perhaps stress one point which has to do with Central Europe, but which is a trans-European phenomenon, as you mentioned, and that is a question of democracy, the crisis of democracy, the crisis of trust in institutions, the politics of defiance that we see everywhere. And you remember discussions a few years ago, say 10 years ago, to put it like, the discussion was about the democratic deficit in the EU. Okay, the EU, the European project, that was the democratic deficit, because the EU was an institution based on the market and on legal norms. And this was hollowing out of politics. That's what we are told. Pierre Manon and others have written books, you know, Gaucher, etc., have written serious books about that democracy is really rooted in the nation states. That's how it historically has emerged in Europe, and that's why it is. Well, what we see today is that democracy in the nation states is undermined, and I would put a conclusion, and it is perhaps contained to some extent by the EU. That may be the twist. It is being undermined. I mean, it started, of course, you remember just a few years ago, it was Hungary, Orban, illiberal democracy. So people like myself were asked, you know, to write about illiberal. Then there was Poland, and then it has gradually extended. Look at the Austrian election, you have right and extreme right. Now we have Italy, and my colleague Marc Lazare thinks Italy is a laboratory of political change in Europe. Well, some laboratory. And if you look at the big survey that is appearing this month, that Fondapol is going to publish, and it's a pan-European, the whole of the European Union, and you see that this is not just a bunch of rebel-rousers trying to stir up trouble in the EU. No, you ask people about trust in political parties, rock bottom. Institutions, political institutions, very low. Government, extremely low. And therefore, this is a problem with national governments. I brought some figures, and I don't think I will. A distrust of media, 75% average in the EU. You ask, what is the highest trust among EU citizens today? Army, police, everything that represents security, religious institutions also, etc. So yes, we are, even that is, do we need, among the questions asked, do we need a strong man to fix it, to, you know, to control this chaos? Well, we still have a majority, large majority that says no, but you have over 40% people who think, maybe strong man. This is the EU average. This is not just a bunch of retarded countries who have recently joined and perhaps because of their communist background or whatever have not been ready for it. So this is where I see the main problem, how to go further in the European project if the distrust in political elites and institutions at the national level, I'm stressing at the national level, how could European democracy be going anywhere if the national democracy is in shambles? And that, of course, affects, I think, even countries such as Britain with Brexit, France with the Gilets jaunes, etc., etc. So this is one thing. The second point I was going to mention, but I think I will be taking too much time. We thought a few years ago, if you had asked us this question, you know, what is your anxiety, what is your worry? A few years ago in the economic field, you would have said, well, the North-South divide and the Greek crisis was really the focal point. Today, you could have good news. You would say Spain and Portugal have made this spectacular recovery, but Italy, again, the laboratory, is the great worry. And if that is the case, there are people on this panel who know much more about that than I do, then the Greek crisis would have looked like a sideshow. Final point, what is more worrying, or what is new, let's say, is our environment has changed. Russia and Putin reassertion, not just in his immediate neighborhood in Ukraine, in the Middle East, through Syria, and more generally, this new Cold War with the United States. You have the Islamic threat in the south, so this is in the east. In the south, we have collapsing states and the Islamic threat. And now we have uncertainty, unpredictability in the White House. So this is, of course, confronting the European Union with a completely new situation, which is to think geopolitically. It was said by predecessors that the EU believed that its sort of model of norm, rule-based order would be extended from the EU to its neighborhoods and perhaps to the international system. It's the other way around. It's the logic of power. It's a logic of geopolitics that is confronting the EU. So this is an entirely new situation for which the EU has not been prepared, has not been made for that. In fact, it was made to contain geopolitics. Now it is confronted with it. And that can play both ways. It can either contribute to weaken it, and this is how it looks to some. It's weak, ineffective, unable to face it. Or, I would argue, if you look at Putin in the east, the Islamists in the south, and Trump in the White House, that may be concentrating the minds of the Europeans. That would be the positive
that is
element.
Certainly a dimension that we will get to as we have 1 hour to go, which is indeed very comfortable. But before we dwell into the internal factors again, I'd like to ask the ambassador about has there been any good surprise about the EU ever since your country has taken the presidency? A good surprise.
Thank you. No, actually, this is what we were paid for as a presidency, a rotating presidency. We have to look as well on the white spots, on the bright spots in this very bleak picture which was presented here. But if you take all these arguments and you look into them, I think you can find a lot of,
Forgive me, but if you could talk a bit closer to the mic,
a lot of positive things nobody is mentioning, or they are mentioning as a negative. First of all, I think we have a clear understanding that now we understand better what are the capabilities of Europe, and in the same time, and we understand very as well the vulnerabilities. We understand a lot better which are the weak spots in Europe, I think today than 3 years ago. As a presidency, what we have seen first of all, and I think we have not taken enough stock, was such a traumatic exercise like the Brexit gave so much hope of unity. The level of cohesion we got when it came to and the unity of the 27 when it came to Brexit, we know it's one of the, so to say, good news of the European project that the pro-European project is working. This was actually the crash test, because if we have not been so, then of course we will not discuss here theoretical issues. We would have discussed about something else than the European project. In the same time, we have to recognize that this is nothing new under the sun. So the way we could move better and we had more convergence and integration advance was when the interests converged. And I think this is nothing new. This is the way we have done business in Europe has not been changed. And as a presidency, I could say that we have been not positively surprised, but because we were more optimistic than everybody at the start, but we have seen that the machinery is working. So the mechanics of making law and European law really functioned. I think we had in the first 2 months of our presidency adopted more, we closed more files than the Austrian presidency. And you know, at the end it was the classical environment. You have a commission that is near its end of the term, you have a European Parliament that is going to be campaigning, and you have the Council that wanted to deliver as much as possible. So, you know, nobody said, we don't want any more Europe, so we should not legislate. We should not forget that the basic of the project at the end is European law. And the fact that you are able to legislate and legislate on issues which are very strategic, like gas directive or the copyright. And, you know, they respond as well to the external dimension. Some of them, you know, are European affairs business that responds to the external dimension when it comes to relationship with Russia, when it comes to, you know, the transatlantic link. So, and in this environment, I think Romania delivered pretty well, and not Romania, the Council itself. We have been able to find the qualified majority voting, and that means that, you know, one of the lessons we have to learn is that we have all this fascinating discussion about repatriation of competencies and how we bring back what we have given. At the end, you know, it's depending who is in charge. So, you know, if some of the countries don't trust, the issue is about the mistrust about who is there, but I would doubt we are going to have the same type of the same type of ideological approach after the European elections if everybody would find a piece of the pie. Another thing that we have to be sure is that where I do not agree is that, and I really do not agree with what was said, and I think we cannot agree, is the fact that we need to move forward on different formats. Because at the end of the day, this is actually what is the call coming from the anti-system forces. You know, nobody wants to leave Europe. Everybody would like to have a national state inside Europe and have all the benefits, but not to have the not to have all the responsibilities that come from being a member of the Union, but taking all the advantages. So I think this is not the way forward. And this brings me to another part that we have not spoken enough, and this for our presidency is a priority, is we have to notice that enlargement regained momentum. Just the fact that here we speak about 30 countries that could be members, or 30 plus.
That's what our Italian friend has said.
Yes, but you know, this is exactly the time when this is gaining. You know, I think thanks as well to our host, to the Greek government, but not only. I think we are in a spring that speaks a lot more about enlargement than I think in the last 5 years. So we have this contradiction in terms that we say it's too much Europe, there are too many or something, but then we say, yes, but Europe is delivering and is bringing good people, and including for the narrative that looked so ugly when it came to Britain that somebody wants to leave the Union, it's quite reinforcing, it's reassuring, and in the same time, you know, it could be considered a beacon of hope that, you know, many are ready to do things and they are ready to give up national competencies in order to be able to join the Union. And this has not been recognized as such, as much as it should. And we are going to have the summit in Sibiu. This is not going to be a milestone, but this is going to be an important moment. And it's going to be important in the sense that if we show the right, if we give the right impression that of the minimum unity, you know, Europe never functioned on everybody agreeing on everything. Europe all the time functioned on finding the common denominator that could bring us forward. And if in Sibiu we are able to move and to give this signal that, of course, elections are elections, but everybody believes that we can do things together, like, as I said, we have done more in the last couple of months that we have done before, when it came to the Brexit, when it came to the enlargement. This would be a good signal, I think, for what is coming. Everybody is betting on the new configuration of the European Parliament, or how it's going to look. What I can see right now, I see that there is no...
If you don't mind, we'll get to that at some point. I'd like to get back, Daniela, to what you said about, and it's a leitmotif. We've heard that before, that somehow Europe never has the right narrative to convince its own citizens. Not so much about the benefits, but that's the attitude of national governments, which use Brussels as an easy scapegoat every time something goes wrong. But what you said about the loss of trust and the fact that there is that vacuum now inside every member country, even in Germany. Although I saw in the last Eurobarometer the Germans have never been as much convinced about Europe as they are now. Still, tell us more about this idea that we need to eventually find a narrative that would help fill that huge mistrust inside each of our national entities.
Thank you for that question. I think I'll answer in two parts. One is about the narrative, and the other one is who should drive the narrative. Now, I think for the narrative, policymakers have for a very long time been able to explain the value of Europe by looking back at our history. And this is particularly true for Germany, but I think it applies to almost any EU country, be it a Western or an Eastern or Central European country. So it was easy to argue why we did this, but at some point, I think we started lacking a narrative what we are doing it for. So what is the purpose of this? What are the goals we want to achieve? Of course, the treaties say a lot about goals for the European Union, but it wasn't concretely translated into a political narrative that, for instance, the parties would stand up for in the elections. At least not to a degree that it would make their way to the citizens. Of course, every party that stands for European elections has a program, but when you look at the way European elections, for instance, are conducted, people don't really understand usually what they are exactly voting for and what the difference is between the parties.
Especially if European elections are taking place at the same time as national elections. Which
Indeed. And the other thing that happened was, again, for decades, national policymakers were the ones that built the link between the citizens and the EU system because they provided the legitimacy back to their citizens. They said, this is good, we did it because of that, so, we agree. But this has broken down. If you look at, and you mentioned the scapegoating of Brussels, this runs across EU member states. So today, you find far less policymakers in the national system who regularly make the case for European policy decisions. They may be willing to make the case for the EU in general, but this idea to defend the policy choices that they are part of on the EU level towards a domestic audience, that willingness has diminished considerably. Now, there's nothing at this point that would step in, because if you look at the structure of European parties, they don't build the link between the ordinary citizen and the system. They show up, the party groups show up in times of European elections, but you can't even be a member of a European party because we haven't yet created that. So I think, if we want to provide legitimacy on the EU level for EU policy decisions, it's not only a question of reforming the institutional system and bringing, the European Parliament into more relevant decisions. It is also about building the democratic fabric between that system and the citizen. And that's not only a question of party structures, it's also a question of political education and of, bringing Europe to the curricula in schools as early as that, and then doing what we can for people to actually experience Europe. For instance, mobility among EU member states is still mostly an elite thing, if we are honest. A little change through the repercussions of the financial and economic crisis, because we see more mobility of young people from those countries where there's high youth unemployment towards others. But I'm not saying this is good. This is obviously a phenomenon which creates more trans-European experiences, but we have to go about this in a more, let's say, more engaged way, and to open this European experience, which includes early language acquisition, in my view, language skills. We have to start far earlier. If that doesn't work, I don't think we will move in any way towards a system where we have more of a trans-European public space, civil understanding, and political engagement. And so if we don't get that, I don't see how we can, I don't think we can go back to, let's say, the 1990s, where this old system of providing legitimacy still worked. And if we don't manage to create something new, and technology and IT definitely offers ways, I think we will end up in a system where, yeah, we are having nation states in maybe a single market that interact, where the elites take policy decisions, but without strong political repercussions within the countries, because they won't be able to build that backing and consensus nationally.
Loukas, this idea of there's indeed a sort of transnational space between member countries, and indeed, and to some extent, even it touches upon political issues, as we saw between France and Italy as of late, where indeed the big row over Mr. Di Maio coming to meet the Gilets jaunes, it was paradoxically a proof that there's a sort of transnational phenomenon. But in your view, and to add up to what Daniela just suggested, does that mean we have to wait for yet another generation, or maybe two, that would be better educated and who would handle the kind of narrative that's needed? But what can we do in the short term? And again, I'm stressing at this stage of our discussion on internal factors.
Okay, let me first, if I may, go back to the point made by Daniela. She talks about narrative. Narrative is, of course, important, but I believe that in Europe today we need much more than words. We need action. Let's see what we have experienced in the recent periods, which is, I think, one of the most important developments, is the emergence of winners and losers within our countries. And this is not just a question of narrative, it's a fact. A large part of our societies, in some countries more than in others, people feel left behind. They feel they are losing from economic change. And unless you address this problem, whatever you tell them will not be enough. Our countries have become increasingly divided. Of course, the weaker countries more divided than stronger countries like Germany. And that is a problem, and interestingly enough, this is not just a European phenomenon, this is an international phenomenon. The problem of winners and losers within countries is a problem that you experience in the United States, you experience in the UK, you experience it in the rest of the Union. And in fact, it is one of the main factors behind the emergence of Trump and Brexit. So this is an issue we need to address. Now, I would accept that this is an issue that you need to address at the national level, but not only. Remember that the implicit division of labor in Europe for decades was that Europe is the liberalizer and the nation state redistributes. In a world where there are more and more winners and losers within countries, this becomes an increasingly untenable division of labor. Now, this may be la constatation, I mean, what we observe. What you do about it is more difficult, because start talking about social policy at the European level is politically extremely difficult, okay? And I recognize that. I mean, this is not easy. Now, going back to what you mentioned, the transnational, again, the discrepancy we are facing is that we are talking about a European economy and national politics. And this is a problem that we've been trying to grapple with all along, but it has become much more acute in the recent period because economic integration has deepened and national politics has become more problematic. So, okay, so you have Mr. Di Maio who goes and talks to the Gilets jaunes. But again, if I may, so I apologize for raising problems rather than offering solutions.
No, that will be for the conclusion, of course.
Okay, we'll come back to that. But another point mentioned, mobility. Okay. Mobility is one of the 4 fundamental freedoms, free movement of people, important. On the other hand, remember what has happened in the recent period. The weaker countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, have lost a large chunk of their population. And that includes the most dynamic and best educated people in their societies. I mean, Bulgaria has lost more than 20% of its population. Similar things can be said about Latvia. Romania has lost probably something like 5 million people. Now we are experiencing the migration of our best educated people in Greece, Italy, and to a smaller extent, Spain. So is mobility the solution to the problem? I don't think so. It's creating the opportunities to keep people at home. And how do you do that? We'll come back to the end.
Good. Jean Pisani-Ferry, this idea that the division of labor has shifted dramatically, that national governments would see to distributions so that the discrepancy between winners and losers within the national space wouldn't be as blatant as it has become, and the EU becoming the provider. Would you subscribe to that analysis?
100%. I totally agree with what Loukas said. I think it's extremely important because the contract was clear. I mean, the EU was about efficiency and the member states were about redistribution. Now, this contract is broken. This contract is broken because the distributional issues have become much more important, and that because the EU seems indifferent to the distributional consequences, to the inequality consequences of its own policies. And even more, take the issue of taxation. Taxation has become a big issue, tax fairness. I mean, you know, the taxation of those who evade taxation. Now, what has the EU done, if we look seriously? Who ended bank secrecy? Not the EU. The EU was an obstacle to it, because we were governed by unanimity. And we had within the EU 2 countries or 3 countries that opposed the end of bank secrecy. It was done through the G20 and through the OECD. The EU was on the wrong side of the battle. That's reality. And the same is happening with corporate taxation. We're facing the same. The US is pushing for some form of solution. Some member states are pushing for it on their side. And it's likely that it's going to end up with another agreement within the framework of the OECD, with some arm twisting, and with a big pressure of the US, which is surprisingly, the Trump administration is open to an agreement on international taxation and to the end of this avoidance and the fact that multinationals are putting their profit into tax havens. So we're going to find an alliance with the US and with you know, a large majority of member states, but not all of member states. And again, the EU will not prove able to contribute to this problem. So, speaking of narrative, to take the point of Daniela, I strongly agree also with Loukas that the problem is much more effectiveness than its narrative. I mean, we can have new narratives for the EU. I think we're not short of them. Speaking of, you know, all the change in the global situation, and the fact that this multilateral system that we were used to and we were part of is a thing of the past, and that we have to reinvent our stance in international economic relations and in international relations in general, and international security, in a very different world. And that's a very strong narrative for the EU, because evidently those are issues in which we have largely common interests, and we are individually too weak to have a weight in international negotiation. But again, that's a matter of effectiveness. You know, are we able to do something? Are we able to agree on something? That's what brings me to this issue of differentiation I talked about, and to which the ambassador said he disagreed. We have to find ways to move forward. Now, we had historically, we had two ways. One was to say, let's move at different speed. So we pretend that we have the same goal, but we move at different speed. The question is that when we have strong disagreement, we can't even pretend that we have the same goal. You know, take the issue of asylum. Mr. Orban is saying very clearly he doesn't have the same goal. He's saying very clearly, I don't feel I have to abide by the EU laws in this regard. I have my own view. And so we have different goals. And you can't pretend that you have the same goal if, in fact, you don't have the same goal. That's a lie, and that's not going to work. The other way was to say, let's decide by majority voting. But again, take the issue of asylum. We did that. There was a decision taken by majority voting. And simply, it was not enforced. Because some countries said, you know, you can take whatever decision you want. We're not going to apply this decision because we disagree.
Starting with France.
Starting with France on...
Mainly.
Well, I mean, that was not the worst. That was not the worst. No, sorry, I can criticize this country. Okay, I leave it to Sandro because he's well placed to discuss this issue from the point of view of the differences we had with Italy. Now, what does it mean, differentiation? I think it means that we have to distinguish the sort of the basis, the common basis, on which we can agree. That's essentially built around the single market. That's essentially built around this economic integration, to which we must add a series of policies that underpin economic integration, like consumer protection, like competition policy, to which we must add some budgetary dimension, the structural funds, but to which we must add also some core values that are essential in the membership in the EU, to the membership in the EU. The EU is not a sort of pure economic endeavor. It has to be built on values. So I think that's the core. And on that basis, we should admit that there needs to be coalitions of the willing for different purposes. And again, it's not going to be everybody, going with sort of concentric circles, so that the same who will do defense, or will do asylum and refugee, or will do Euro, they will all be the same. No, it's not the same. We'll have different clubs. And those clubs, they will have to be anchored in this basis, so that there's a common legal system, there's a common institutional system to the extent possible, but we have to accept this differentiation. Now, it will be hard. For example, let's take again this issue of asylum and refugee. Can we, for long, accept that we have a Schengen system in which we're saying, we have no borders, and at the same time we have completely different policies as regards our external borders? That doesn't work. I mean, you can't have a system in which you're saying people move freely without control, and at the same time we fundamentally disagree on this issue of asylum and refugees. That's inconsistent. So we have to confront those issues. We have to confront that. We have to confront the issue of what really goes with the euro. And on that, we have a number of disagreements. And, we haven't been able to sort out all our disagreement. I'm quite disappointed by the outcome of the discussion on the euro and the strengthening of the euro. But on each of those circles, clubs, we have to define what's consistent. And that, I think, the way to move forward. Now, can we do that? I think it's really not about the next 6 months, but it's about the next 5 years or so. And again, the test for the citizen will be very simple. Is the EU part, or is Europe, with this differentiation, part of the solution or not? If they see that we're very good with the narrative, but we're very bad with the implementation, they would say perhaps it's nice, perhaps in principle, Europe was a good solution to a number of problems we're facing. But if it's in fact not part of the solution, they're going to turn to the member state, to the nation state, because that's where they can turn to find solutions.
Sandro, this idea that in order to move forward, there could be different clubs, not the same coalitions, depending on each issue. how could that be feasible if, again, we cannot get to adopting the majority rule?
I do believe that it is perfectly possible. You have different ways, and I will tell you what are the different ways. But first, I would like to tell you why I stress again the necessity of this idea. Because for two reasons. Because we need action, we need to deliver, and on the new issues, on the new problem that we have been talking about, we cannot deliver today at 27. So we need to find a way to go ahead with group of countries. I fully agree with everything has been said, Daniela, Jean, Loukas, but I mean, what they were saying, what is the golden thread of what they said with their example? The golden thread is that we have entered into a new political and historical phase of what the Union should do. They say, and they're right, well, Schengen means freedom, okay? Single market means freedom. So far, we have managed to ensure freedom within the single market, freedom with Schengen. What we needed to do in order to ensure this freedom? We needed to dismantle. We needed rules that eliminate obstacles. We needed it's a neutral word, a negative approach. That means eliminate obstacles to our freedom. And this is why we could be perfectly happy. I wasn't, but we could be, I admit, perfectly happy with the Europe of rules and with the Europe of surveillance. Today, we have to shift from ensuring freedom to building up the instrument to ensure freedom and delivery. For example, external border. You cannot limit yourself to dismantle. You have to build up. You have to take bold political decisions. We cannot limit in the Eurozone to say, you do your house of Gabe, every references to one single country is perfectly wanted, house of Gabe, homework, you do your house of Gabe, and everything will fall into in a clean way. It is clear that we have to comply with the rule of convergence, but we need positive, constructive investment policies, positive, constructive, distributed social policies, also at European level. So we have to shift from an Europe of only rules to a Europe of bold political decision. And this is why we cannot accept, we cannot continue. I mean, listen, I wouldn't advise anybody to go to the next European elections. And when it comes before an audience in a small town in our country, the issue of social inequalities, I would never advise anybody to give the answer that was given to me. But at the time, Economic Commissioner Olli Rehn, at the time, Governor of the Bank of Italy, Ignazio Visco, at the time, Minister of Economics, Tremonti, we said, but it is not in our competence, the social inequalities. I mean, don't do it. If you love Europe, don't do it. Say, we have to build up also some.
But that's the narrative. It's
some
not,
social
it's
policies.
Not action.
Some social policy at European level. We have proposed under our government and under our presidency a European unemployment insurance scheme, for example, to support also what we do in case of asymmetric shock in a sector or in a region, what we do to fight against unemployment at national level. So can we do it at 27? No, we cannot do it at 27 because Orban or Kaczynski are the best ally of the status quo. Because Poland and Hungary are perfectly happy with this situation when they get the best of the two worlds. We are not happy with the situation. France is not happy with the situation.
And
Greece is not happy with the situation. So this is why we need to take a bold decision to move ahead as a group of countries. How? Either exploiting all the instruments that you have in the treaty. I mean, after all, we have managed, even if it's very weak, to launch the idea of a European public prosecutor through a group of countries. we can do things through the treaty, or we use positively what we have done to do things which I like less, but I mean, we have introduced the fiscal compact with an international treaty signed by a group of countries. We have introduced the European Stability Mechanism through an international treaty signed by some countries. We can use other ways other legal ways to reach those objectives. We don't have to be blocked by national veto. If there is another round, I will tell you what I think about transnational politics.
Okay, Jacques Rupnik, I'd like to get back to the last point you made in your first intervention. This idea that many of us had some time ago, that somehow with Mr. Trump on the one side, Mr. Putin on the other side, and also Mr. Xi further away, we Europeans would come to realize that we really have not only to stick together, but really to move forward together. Do you think there's any momentum of that sort, short of total dismay and common dismay about the current geopolitical mess?
Momentum, perhaps not yet, but certainly there are, the issues are there, and there are attempts to respond to them, perhaps belatedly. I mean, the migration issue has been related. The migration issue is related to a security problem that arose on the southern Mediterranean border. This is, you know, you have state collapse, civil war, and mass migration into Europe. So you have a security issue in our neighborhood and a migration issue which has largely contributed to implode our political system, our party system. I mean, if we discuss populism in Europe, that is directly related. So you have a direct relation between the security issue and the freedom of movement that has been mentioned and the politics, the party politics of our country. So I agree. I mean, there may be exceptional circumstances where you say, oh, Schengen is not working. Well, then, if that is true, there was exceptional circumstances. But then you have the obligation to fix it. If Schengen 1 is not working, you must provide immediately Schengen 2. We are 2 years, 3 years after. We haven't seen much. Or we're seeing the beginnings of that. So I would say this is the one thing, the slow pace of European response confronted with a fast pace of European politics confronted with those issues. Now,
but that's also, sorry to interrupt, because immigration is not a common policy. No. It is not. Well, immigration, it's a national policy, and there are the Dublin agreements, which of course fell apart. But again, the idea that somehow Europe could deal with just everything doesn't really apply, because national governments are very eager to protect their own power.
Yes, they are, and we have seen, for instance, the Visegrad countries simply said, we are not going to do it. And they even took it to court, the European court, and eventually they lost, and there was a decision that was taken by the European court, and guess what? It was not implemented. This is a major, this is actually, nobody paid much attention to that, but the fact that you have a court decision that is simply being ignored for political expediency, that is a very, very worrying sign. I mean, the fact that there are European political tensions, disputes that has been also, this I think is totally new, and if we talk about undermining the rule of law, and this is a problem that some EU countries have, well then what if the EU itself is becoming part of that process? So this is worrying. My point would be, as has been said, you cannot have the freedom of movement if you do not have common border security policy. So the security policy has been brought to people on the southern front. It exists also on the eastern borders. East European member states are much more sensitive to it than maybe people in France or Spain, but this is a very sensitive issue, what is happening in the Ukraine, the concern. And if they see that the EU is not able to fix it, they put all their eggs in the NATO basket. What can contribute maybe to the European sursaut, you would say in French. That is the attempt to think in strategic and security terms as Europe, is what is happening in NATO with the United States' relationship to NATO. There are now, serious doubts. I don't have to give you the long list of these doubts that are there. And so that is the second incentive that I would say that works. What is happening on our eastern periphery and what is happening in the NATO question mark. If in those circumstances Europeans do not feel that they have a common, let's say, agenda, common challenge, no state of the EU can pretend that they can fix it on their own, okay? So there is you need, of course, political will to do that. This is bringing politics. This is no longer talking about economic issues, regulations, etc. This is bringing out politics. This is why it is so difficult. And you have either countries, the East Europeans, but not only, who think NATO is the alpha and omega in security terms, and therefore as soon as they hear the unfortunate word European army,
yes,
I think
that should be
that
forbidden
clearly was an
vocabulary.
unfortunate term, because you have a real issue that is there. You have a real need for Europe to think in those terms. But as soon as you take security, European army, people panic and think this is never going to happen, and you're back to square one. I do think that what has happened in the last few years has been the return of politics in European affairs. This is the only positive thing in a very bad situation, that we have been forced to think politically. And the unfortunate side is the people who force you to think politically about Europe are the people who are against it, are the rise of nationalist, populist, sovereignist movements. They force you to think politically as a counterweight. And the others who force you to think politically is our neighborhood, the Islamists, Putin, and now Trump. That forces you to think politically. And that will not happen by consensus, by 28. I really believe there you will have to have the political will of, let's say, core countries. It's always difficult to know what the core should be like, but the old debate about can the Franco-German tandem still initiate anything. I would say only one thing about the current situation. We have a Europe divided on a number of issues, east, west, north, south, etc. We know that. In this context, Macron's 4 speeches on Europe, there was the feeling that there is an attempt to respond to what I just said, to bring politics to shape some kind of European agenda. There was also a great hope that perhaps on the German side, after the elections, something would happen. What we have seen since, and this would be the counterweight, let's say, to the alliance of Orban, Salvini, Kaczynski, etc. Because there is this alliance, of course. As you have seen, Orban,
well, Salvini, they don't agree on everything.
They don't agree on everything, but they agree that they don't want Brussels, that they don't want France and Germany in particular to initiate any new thing. I'll just close with saying, I had that hope that the real counterweight to those who are in the business of dismantling or weakening Europe would be precisely the Macron moment and Germany after the election. And that has not happened. Macron has been weakened with the Gilets jaunes movement. Merkel herself is weakened for reasons you know as well. And therefore, the two who could have initiated something are not in a position or have not been able to do so. And this is the worrying side, that is the political response that is needed will not come from anywhere else, I feel.
Daniela, Jacques mentioned the very, very good speeches that Macron made, but they were only speeches. And very good ones, but unfortunately politics have taken over since. And Madame Merkel delivered an extraordinary speech in Munich, and of course you were there, for once very emotional about the need for we Europeans to actually confront the total shift in American diplomacy to start with. But this idea that there could be any common ground for common foreign policy, isn't that a fallacy? There's, of course, an external service. I guess they do whatever they can. But on major issues, on current issues, starting with Venezuela, where Greece is still, as I understand, on the side of Mr. Maduro, and many other issues, we see that indeed national governments always decide that it is their privilege and indeed their sovereignty that is at stake. And so, okay, nice talk about foreign and defense common issues, but when it comes to implementing something, that's becomes national again.
Yes. So, yeah, the Merkel speech was a big speech. In particular, if you compare it to former Merkel speeches, you said the emotional thing, the value base that she highlighted, but it was weak in one point, and that is that she didn't deliver any concrete proposals how to do this. There's a lot of continuity between that Munich speech and what she first said on the election of Donald Trump. Her immediate reaction was reminding the US administration and the president of the transatlantic value base, and she did that again in Munich. And she called on Europeans to stand together and to be more forceful, but the question is, how can you deliver? And, you know, we've been speaking about differentiation, qualified majority voting, and so on and so on. I think for the field of foreign and security and defense policy, we will move forward in a differentiated way. It will be small groups of countries getting together, agreeing on something, maybe in some instances working for the EU as a whole implicitly, so backed by the others. But I don't see us moving towards a system where we decide on strategically important foreign policy decisions by qualified majority vote, although I know the German government defends this idea and says we have to move there to get more operational. I don't think that can happen. But we need to do much more.
And it cannot happen, why?
Well, because you need unanimity to take that decision.
So we get back to that major blockade.
And I believe, and that's where I think we are in a critical situation in the European Union at the moment. There have been examples on foreign policy choices where single European member states did not vote with the others. And the reasons that at least were ascribed to them why they did that was because of external influences in their home countries. One example is, and I'm happy to be challenged on that, as I'm saying it in Delphi, the Greek decision not to vote with the Europeans on a UN declaration on human rights. There is a story that this was because of Chinese influence. And I'm just telling this as one example. There are others where you can see similar traces of individual countries' interest with single external players who don't necessarily have the goal of strengthening the European Union. You see policy decisions that reflect that. And I think that is our biggest challenge at the moment, that the longer we wait with our internal consolidation, the more vulnerable we get to outside influences, and the less likely it is that Europe actually can act forcefully internationally. And what you can see very clearly at this point is there are some policy areas where Europe is a unified actor. That is true for trade, of course, because this is an EU competence. There's a current discussion going on, which I think is very important, on the international role of the euro. I mean, we have monetary competence pooled, but there are other elements to add to make, you know, the Eurozone be more of a unified actor represented in international fora in a different way. And we have to be very serious in looking at those areas where at this point we are still very vulnerable, not to be able to take decisions together. And I think the sort of short and medium term solution, the only one I see, is to act in smaller groups of countries. Then there is a whole other story, and I think there we have something positive to tell for the EU over the past, 12 months, and that is the progress in defense cooperation. PESCO, Structured Defense Cooperation, was launched in December 2017. this is now a good year that it has evolved. Of course, there are conflicts over how it should look like, what the exact goal should be, and so on. But what we see is a European reaction to a very rapidly changing global security environment, a realistic assessment that NATO security guarantees and the US commitment to NATO is fragile, and we can't rely on that. And Europe has, in my view, found in substance the right answer to say we need to do more, and we need to provide more capabilities as Europeans within the NATO framework. But the way it has presented this has given rise to both internal discussions, and the example of a European army was mentioned. I would say the other term that is ill-chosen is strategic autonomy, because it raises expectations that we are far from meeting, and it raises the illusion that we can or even want to work without the US, which I think is no goal and should not be a goal in the medium term. But there's still progress, and I think that's important, that Europeans have decided to take more responsibility in that field.
Thank you. Before we leave the conclusion of this discussion to our Romanian friend, I would like to ask you, Loukas, as indeed this is the time now to find some, if not some solutions, but some positive steps or some optimistic signs in this cycle that we are trying to swim through. What would be your most optimistic scenario?
Okay. In an age of pessimism, I shall try to be optimistic.
Pessimists are usually, the best at that exercise.
Okay. First point, I think, first priority for me would be to move ahead in terms of the banking union and strengthening the Eurozone before the next financial crisis hits us and before Italy gets out of control. So that is crucial. The second, perhaps on the economic side, Jean mentioned it, taxation. But on taxation, we cannot apply differentiation, because if we apply differentiation to taxation, we simply make the room for free riders. Because if you're trying to deal with the problem of tax evasion, then you cannot agree on the level of 25 or 24 and to say, I'm sorry, I don't agree, because those people will be exactly the free riders in the business. I think Europe needs a stronger social dimension, because we have to be able to tell the people within our countries that are worried that they're left behind, that it's not only national government, but the European Union recognizes that there is a problem and there are measures. For example, unemployment insurance scheme would be a good example of where Europe can actually move ahead, a shared responsibility between Europe and the national government. And I would fully agree with Daniela that foreign and security policy are key priorities, and there, differentiation is going to be the name of the game, because there's no alternative to that.
Thank you. Ambassador, may I ask you to, if not to actually conclude the discussion, but at least to give us some perspectives about the next few months and years.
Yes, so let me be a little bit more practical, because as having the presidency, we have to be more pragmatic. And I think one of the things has not been mentioned here is that we have we have in the audience a couple of former ministers of finance, so nobody underlined the importance of the multi-financial framework. We are now negotiating the next budget of the Union. This is going to show exactly what kind of policies the Union would encourage. I do not agree as much on the idea that you can do still the single market and have a regrouping of national competencies and have a stronger national state, because at the end of the day, we have done European integration as well with a view to the single market. A single market is not going to function if we start to split national competencies. So I think the budget is going to show what kind of Europe we'd like to see, how you see something that, European project was based on subsidy, how we are going to leverage that, either on a national level, with a subsidy, to encourage a social Europe, or we are going to keep on what was the main mission of the Europe and of the single market was to bring convergence to all the member states. So we should not forget that the relationship between convergence and cohesion is of utmost important. I cannot have a single market that is functioning fully well when you have such differences of per capita income. So I think this is the thing that has to be kept, and we are going to see it as a metro policy. When it comes to foreign policy, exactly as Daniela was saying, we have not taken stock enough of the writings PESCO. You know, PESCO reinforced cooperation that was not possible before because we tried in the past. We tried to have something like PESCO. I remember. And, you know, we had strong member states that could not agree on. And exactly at the time when you have the Brexit, it's of great importance to have the foreign policy, I think, more consolidated than ever, because we should not forget that Britain was giving more to foreign policy and to the defense policy of the Union. So Europe without Britain is going to be different and has to be more cohesive in its action. And the issue of course, how you name it, European, NATO, is depending a lot on the geography. It's depending where you are. You know, when you are in Romania, you have a different view on how security plays. When you see very close to your borders what's going on, you know, you feel different. It's another, of course, for the other member states, security means mostly protecting their citizens, and you know, the citizens should feel protected against terrorism, against, you know, other type of activities that actually enhance and need cooperation. We cannot go, frankly speaking, for any kind of splitting up of the action of the Foreign Affairs Council for the very, so to say, basic understanding that this has to be based on information that is shared by all. So how are you going to share information if you start to do qualified majority approach? Who is going to share with whom? So I think, and when it comes to qualified majority voting, we should pay notice that there are countries that support it when it comes to taxation policy, and the same country could not support it when it's going to come to foreign policy. There are big countries now, and I think big governments that have the argument now, and this I can tell you from the experience of the presidency, that we should not move files related to foreign policy or enlargement, because this would jeopardize their position in the upcoming elections, because they are facing strong opposition. So in a way, if we start behaving like the others, the anti-system part, I don't see such a big difference, because if our action is not going to be guided by what we need to do and when we can do and when we can deliver things, but by political formulas, this is not a good omen for us. You know, Romania is going to have the summit in Sibiu. After the summit, the elections are, and the last month is going to be crucially important for all the issues that could not be sorted because of the elections. So we'll have a very short period of time for non-legislative issues, but this would mean as well more foreign policy and more related to enlargement. So let me try, you know, Europe is neither a dystopia or utopia. So it's something that has to, and we have to recognize that it's functioning. You know, well, I don't know how it's going to be in a couple of years, but right now from the presidency, I think we have pretty observed that it's functioning, and you know, the institutions are working, and we hope this is going to stay like that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think all our panelists deserve applause, and we are finishing right on time. Thank you.